The sound of a crown hitting cold stone echoes through an empty throne room. Blood drips from its twisted iron spikes onto marble floors that once gleamed with prosperity. In the shadows, a figure sits motionless on a throne built from the bones of his enemies. His kingdom burns beyond the castle walls, and the screams of his people pierce the night air. This is the story of how a hero became a monster, and how absolute power corrupts absolutely. But it didn't start this way. It never does. Prince Aldric Ravencrest was born into a kingdom where honor meant everything. The realm of Vaelthorne had prospered for 3 centuries under the rule of wise kings who valued justice above all else. Golden fields stretched beyond the horizon, trade routes flourished, and the people lived in peace. Aldric's father, King Tyrant, was beloved by all, a ruler who walked among his subjects, listened to their concerns, and never made a decision without considering its impact on even the poorest farmer. Young Aldric grew up believing that leadership meant service, that a crown was not a symbol of power, but of responsibility. He trained with the kingdom's greatest knights, learned strategy from brilliant tacticians, and studied philosophy with the realm's wisest scholars. The prince showed exceptional promise. His sword arm was strong, his mind sharp, and his heart seemed pure. The people adored him, seeing in his eyes the same compassion that had made his father legendary. But beneath the surface of this perfect kingdom, darker forces stirred. The neighboring realm of Shadowmere, ruled by the cunning King Malachar, had long envied Vaelthorne's prosperity. For years, Malachar had been building his armies, forging alliances with mercenary companies, and spreading whispers of discontent among Vaelthorne's nobles. He understood that the strongest kingdoms could fall not through direct assault, but through the poison of betrayal planted from within. The first sign of trouble came during Aldric's 20th year. Border villages reported strange disappearances, entire families vanishing in the night, leaving behind only burned homes and blood-stained earth. King Tyrant sent his best investigators, but they found no evidence of raiders or wild beasts. The attacks seemed random, purposeless, designed more to spread fear than to achieve any military objective. As months passed, the disappearances grew more frequent. Merchant caravans refused to travel the outer roads. Farmers abandoned their fields closest to the borders. The kingdom's economy began to strain as paranoia took hold. King Tyrant called for calm, increasing patrols and offering protection to isolated communities, but the attacks continued with supernatural precision, always striking where defenses were weakest. The truth revealed itself on a cold autumn night when Aldric led a patrol to investigate reports of movement near the Whispering Woods. What they found defied belief: a camp of Shadowmere soldiers, but these were no ordinary warriors. They wore the black armor of the Shadow Legion, Malachar's elite forces, and they moved with an otherworldly coordination that spoke of dark magic. The battle was swift and brutal. Aldric's men fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. As steel rang against steel in the moonlight, Aldric realized this was no mere border skirmish. It was the beginning of a war that Vaelthorne was unprepared to fight. When dawn broke, only Aldric and 2 of his men remained alive. The Shadow Legion had retreated, but not before leaving behind a message written in blood on the trees: "The old ways die with the old king." The meaning was clear. Malachar wasn't just seeking to conquer Vaelthorne, he was targeting King Tyrant personally. Racing back to the capital,
Aldric found the kingdom in chaos. During the night, coordinated attacks had struck the Royal Guard's barracks, the treasury, and the castle's main defenses. Dozens of loyal soldiers lay dead, and worse still, several prominent nobles had vanished, taken alive, presumably, to be turned against the crown through torture or dark magic. King Tyrant, aged and shaken by the night's events, called an emergency council. The remaining nobles argued among themselves, some calling for immediate military action, others suggesting negotiation with Malachar. But Aldric could see the fear in their eyes, the way they glanced toward the doors as if expecting assassins to burst through at any moment. Before we continue with Aldric's dark transformation, if you're enjoying this tale of power and corruption, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support helps us bring more epic stories to life, and trust me, you won't want to miss how this kingdom's golden age turns to ash. The war that followed was unlike anything in Vaelthorne's history. Malachar's forces didn't simply attack, they tormented. They would strike at supply lines, poison wells, and then disappear before reinforcements could arrive. Refugees flooded the capital with stories of horrors beyond imagination, villages where every person had been turned to stone, forests where the trees themselves had become weapons, and skies that rained blood for days. Traditional warfare proved useless against such supernatural tactics. King Tyrant's armies, trained for honorable combat, found themselves fighting shadows and nightmares. Each defeat weakened not only their numbers, but their morale. Soldiers began to desert, nobles started making separate peace overtures with Malachar, and the common people lost faith in their king's ability to protect them. It was during the siege of Ironhold, Vaelthorne's most important fortress, that everything changed. Aldric watched helplessly as Malachar used some form of dark sorcery to turn the fortress's own defenders against each other. Brothers killed brothers, and fathers struck down sons, and the great walls that had stood for centuries crumbled from within. That night, as Aldric knelt among the ruins of what had once been an impregnable stronghold, something broke inside him. The code of honor his father had taught him, the belief in justice and mercy that had defined his life, all of it seemed worthless in the face of such absolute evil. What good was righteousness when righteous men died screaming? What value did mercy have when the enemy showed none?
The transformation began with a single decision that would damn Aldric's soul forever. As he stood in the ruins of Ironhold, surrounded by the bodies of good men who had died following his father's noble ideals, he made a choice that would echo through history. If Malachar wanted to play with dark forces, then perhaps it was time for Vaelthorne to embrace the darkness as well. The forbidden vaults beneath the royal castle held secrets that King Tyrant had sworn never to use. Ancient texts spoke of rituals that could grant unimaginable power, of ways to command the very forces of death itself. These were the weapons of tyrants and demon kings, tools that no righteous ruler would ever consider. But as Aldric descended into those shadowy depths, righteousness felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. The ritual required a sacrifice, something precious given willingly to the dark powers. Aldric's first thought was of his own life, but the ancient texts were clear. The sacrifice must be of someone else, someone whose death would cause the caster true anguish. Only through such pain could the gates of shadow be opened. The choice that followed would haunt him for eternity. King Tyrant, weakened by the war and the constant strain of leadership, had fallen gravely ill. The kingdom's healers declared that he had perhaps weeks to live, maybe days. As Aldric knelt beside his father's bed, watching the man who had raised him to be a hero waste away, The dark whispers grew louder in his mind. One life to save a kingdom. One death to prevent thousands. The logic was cruel but undeniable. King Tyrant would die anyway. Why not let his death serve a purpose? Why not use it to gain the power needed to destroy Malachar and his Shadow Legion once and for all? The ritual was performed at midnight in the castle's highest tower. Aldric placed his hands on his father's chest as the old king slept, and spoke the words that would forever change the fate of Vaelthorne. The dark magic flowed through him like liquid fire, and King Tyrant's final breath became the first breath of something far terrible than Malachar had ever been. Power coursed through Aldric's veins, the ability to command the dead, to strike fear into the hearts of men with a glance, to bend reality itself to his will. But with that power came a hunger that could never be satisfied, a thirst for control that grew stronger with each passing moment. The compassionate prince who had once wept for his fallen soldiers was gone, replaced by something that viewed human lives as mere pieces on a chessboard. The war against Malachar ended within days. Aldric's new powers allowed him to raise the dead as his army, to turn the very shadows into weapons, and to break the enemy's supernatural forces with magic far darker than anything they possessed. Malachar himself was brought before the new king in chains, begging for mercy that would never come. But victory brought no peace. The nobles who had once served King Tyrant faithfully now cowered before their new ruler, seeing in his eyes the same cold calculation that had characterized their former enemy. The people celebrated the end of the war, but their cheers felt hollow when they looked upon the man who had saved them, if salvation was truly what this was. The prince who sought to save his kingdom has become the very thing he fought against. If this story of power's corruption is gripping you, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. The descent into darkness is far from over. The kingdom that emerged from the ashes of war was indeed secure, but it was no longer the realm of golden fields and laughing children that Aldric had grown up in. The new King Aldric ruled with absolute authority, his word literally law, his displeasure a death sentence. The dead soldiers who had fallen in the war against Malachar now served as his eternal guard, their hollow eyes watching every street corner, every gathering, every whispered conversation. At first, the changes seemed reasonable. Laws were passed requiring citizens to report any suspicious activity. Taxes were increased to fund the reconstruction of damaged cities. Freedom of movement was restricted to prevent enemy infiltration. Each new decree was justified as necessary for security, for protection, for the greater good of the realm. But as months turned to years, the restrictions tightened like a noose around the kingdom's throat. Books were burned if they contained ideas that challenged the king's authority. Artists were commissioned to create only works that glorified the royal house. Children were taught that questioning the king's wisdom was not just illegal, but morally wrong. The nobles who had once been Aldric's friends and advisors found themselves walking on eggshells, never knowing which word might be their last. Those who had served King Tyrant loyally were gradually replaced by men who owed their positions entirely to the new king's favor. Men who understood that their survival depended on absolute obedience. The people, exhausted by years of war and grateful for peace at any price, initially accepted these changes. But gradually, they began to realize that they had simply traded one form of oppression for another. Malachar had threatened them with death from without, King Aldric had threatened them with death from within. The fear remained, but now it came from the very man who was supposed to protect them.
Stories began to circulate, whispered tales of entire families disappearing after someone spoke carelessly about the old days. Merchants reported that their goods were being seized for the crown's use without compensation. Farmers found their lands redistributed to nobles who had earned the king's favor. The kingdom was prosperous, but that prosperity served only those who bent the knee completely. Young men and women who had never known King Theron's gentle rule began to organize in secret. They called themselves the Dawn Rebellion, and they dreamed of restoring the kingdom to its former glory. But their plans were always discovered, their meetings infiltrated, their leaders dragged away in the night by the undead guards that never slept, never tired, and never showed mercy. Aldric himself had become a stranger to his own reflection. The face that looked back at him from mirrors was still recognizably his own, but the eyes had changed. They held depths of cold calculation that would have terrified the young prince he had once been. He told himself that everything he did was necessary, that the harsh measures were temporary, that once the kingdom was truly secure, he could afford to be more lenient. But deep down, he knew the truth. The power that had saved his kingdom had also consumed his soul. Each act of cruelty became easier than the last. Each dissenting voice silenced permanently rather than reasoned with. Each decision made not from wisdom, but from the intoxicating certainty that his will was law, and law was absolute. 20 years after the night he had performed the dark ritual, King Aldric sat alone in his throne room, surrounded by the symbols of his absolute power. The crown on his head was no longer the simple gold circlet his father had worn, but a twisted creation of black iron and precious stones that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The throne itself had been carved from a single piece of obsidian, its surface reflecting the torchlight like captured screams. The kingdom was quiet now, the silence of submission rather than peace. No one dared to speak against the king. No one questioned his wisdom. No one challenged his authority. It was everything he had thought he wanted, but it felt hollow, like an echo in an empty chamber. Reports reached him daily of other kingdoms that had fallen to tyrants, of peoples who had traded their freedom for security and found themselves with neither. He had become a cautionary tale told in whispers beyond his borders, a reminder of how easily good intentions could pave the road to damnation. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Aldric would remember his father's words about leadership being service, about the crown being a burden rather than a privilege. He would think about the young prince who had once believed that doing right was more important than being powerful, and he would feel something that might have been regret if he had still been capable of such emotions. But those moments of reflection were brief. The dark power that flowed through his veins had changed him in ways that went beyond mere cruelty. He had become something more and less than human, a creature of will and domination that could no more return to compassion than a sword could return to being ore. The kingdom endured, prosperous and secure, but it was prosperity built on fear and security purchased with freedom. The people lived, but they did not truly live. They existed, they functioned, they served, but the spark that had once made Vaelthorne a beacon of hope in a dark world had been extinguished forever. As the sun set on another day in his perfect, terrible kingdom, King Aldric realized the ultimate truth about power. It was not something you wielded, but something that wielded you. The crown that had made him a king had also made him a prisoner, trapped forever in a castle of his own making, ruling over subjects who feared him too much to love him, and loving no one enough to fear losing them. The boy who had once dreamed of being a hero indeed had become legendary. But legends, he learned too late, were not always about heroes. Sometimes they were warnings, carved in stone and written in blood, about the price of power and the wages of ambition.
In the end, he had gotten exactly what he had asked for: absolute power over his kingdom. He had simply never considered that absolute power over others might mean absolute isolation for himself. The crown that had made him a king had also made him the loneliest man in the world, sitting forever on a throne of his own design in a kingdom that would never again know the warmth of true leadership. The iron crown grew heavy on his head, and King Aldric closed his eyes, listening to the perfect silence of his perfect kingdom, and wondering if this was what victory was supposed to feel like. And so ends the tale of how a hero became a tyrant, and how the very power meant to save a kingdom ultimately destroyed everything it was meant to protect. If this story moved you, please let us know in the comments below which city you're watching from and which song or band you'd like to see us craft a story around next. Your suggestions fuel our creativity, and who knows, your idea might become our next epic tale. Until then, remember that the greatest battles are often fought not with swords, but with the choices we make when no one is watching.